Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The state as an entity no longer is willing to defend its own authority. No one's willing to put their lives on the line in the same way. No one's willing to kill for it. And once enough people push back on this, it's sort of like a door giving way.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Ned Richardson Little has written a new book titled The German Democratic Republic, The Rise and Fall of a Cold War State. It offers a differentiated picture of the communist state with a sophisticated analysis of life under dictatorship, which candidly confronts the abuses of the East German Communist Party and the Stasi. Ned offers a history of the GDR in a global perspective, which illustrates the worldview of those who ruled it, those who rebelled against the strictures of state socialism, and those in between who sought a normal life under dictatorship. I'm delighted to welcome Ned Richardson Little to our Cold War conversation.
One of the things I think we've seen in the last several years is there's a huge amount of interest in East German history. And in spite of the huge amount of academic work that's been done in the past few decades, very little has actually arrived in the wider public. And in many cases, books that get very wide reception are sort of not really in dialogue with what people are doing on an academic specialist level. In some cases, you've got sort of interpretations that academics see as sort of decades old, that other people see as things that are completely new. And this came about in conjunction with Bloomsbury Press. They want to put together a series of introductory books for people who are sort of arriving at different parts of German history. And the brief was really, can we find a way to take all of this academic literature, which is often stuck behind paywalled journals, maybe not written in a way that's really accessible, can we find a way to take that, synthesize it down, and bring it to a general audience, and try to bring into alignment what academics are talking about, what are these specialists who've been in the archives for so long are working on, and what's really there for the general public.
And you've done that really well. I mean, it's an immensely readable history, and I have tried some rather dry academic tomes in the past and struggled with those, but this works really well. And, I thought I knew quite a lot about the GDR, but there were points where I thought, actually, I wasn't necessarily aware of that. And it's always good to see these different perspectives from the tropes that are often brought out about life in the GDR. So I definitely welcome that.
I think for a lot of people who are looking at this, you have sort of the Stasi-Land idea that this is people who are living their lives constantly under the eye of the Stasi. They're constantly conscious of this. This is where every single random comment people are making, they're incredibly self-conscious that at any moment they could be picked up by the police. And for some people, this is true. But you have a much more complicated landscape politically where there's a give and take between the state, between people. And this is something that's a really long-running conflict across a whole lot of different areas that are far too sort of small to get into for anything beyond specialists. But this question of really how far does state power extend? How much control does the Stasi have? How much does the state have? And when people were able to make complaints or send in complaint letters to the state in factories where they're working, when they were sort of, how much could they gripe about everyday work conditions? And it's this real balance between, on the one hand, you have a secret police that can snatch people up, put them in prison without trial. People's lives are ruined over minor things. People are accused of sabotage. But this isn't happening every single hour of the day. And some people don't have any contact at all to the secret police. On the other hand, I said this problem that dictatorships need to be really acutely aware of how people feel about things going on in society. They need to try and maintain a certain amount of popularity, a certain amount of happiness, because constantly just relying on the secret police to go out and bash heads isn't going to make your government function very well. You're not going to really have a stable country if your only response to people being unhappy about something, if they don't like the way the clothes fit or they don't like the food in the supermarket, that you have to sort of send in the troops every time. And finally, looking at it globally, that if we talk about the GDR as a sort of Cold War creation, it's constantly tied up in all of these problems all across the world, even if people imagine the GDR as this little half country that's walled off and isolated. the politics of whether or not the GDR gets recognition, how it's connected to other countries. This is tied up in the politics of what's happening across Eastern Europe, conflicts in Korea, other states that are being divided, and all of these global economic trends like the oil crisis with coffee at one point is really politically decisive. And so in this way that you can tell the story of the GDR as this one tiny little contained country, but you're really missing the context or what explains how all the people involved are making the actions that they are.
And we will dig into some of these areas as well. So you set out the book in sort of like a chronological order, and obviously the Soviet Union plays a decisive role in the political makeup of the GDR. But I think some people may be surprised that the Soviets believed in a democratic path initially.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to understand what the Soviets are doing unless you look at it from their perspective as people who are Marxists, that they really do actually believe their own ideology. And for them, Germany has gone off track historically. It was supposed to go through a liberal democratic revolution at some point, become a normal parliamentary democracy, but the existence of these sort of aristocratic Junker class, the land-owning people, you look at the Prussians and their militarism, these things pulled Germany off course and it got stuck, not going through the sort of proper revolutionary set of developments that would prepare it to become a real socialist country. They see Marxism as this historical process that you really don't want to tinker with too much. And in the case of Germany, that you need to basically get it back to a good starting point. You can't just go 0 to 60 Nazism straight into communism. And so you need some sort of controlled democratic path in which you have the Communist Party on the ground who the Soviets are backing, and they're going to work with a bunch of friendly anti-fascist forces, figure out some way to establish Germany as a real properly liberal state before it can move on to socialism. And they significantly overestimate how popular this path is going to be. And this is one where it ties in internationally, that this across Eastern Europe, this idea of the Soviet Union as the victors of World War II, this is something that's going to carry them on. The opposition to Nazism, the triumph against the Third Reich, that this is something that's going to bolster communism, show that it's a true path of the future. And not just in the GDR, but also in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they really start hitting on this problem that people do not want to vote for communists. And this initial tension of we're interested in a democratic path, so long as the democratic path still gets us where we want to go.
You touched on a moment ago about the anti-fascist mythology, the GDR as a victor over the Third Reich, and that the Federal Republic, West Germany, is still the enduring home of Nazis and fascists. How effective was denazification in East Germany?
It's hit and miss. I think what the anti-fascism really is there as this thing to grease the wheels socially to make this transition. I mean, just flipping the switch from the majority of Germans who are on board with National Socialism up until fairly late in the war, then suddenly flipping a switch and saying, actually, we're going in the complete opposite direction. We're going to be doing state socialism is not something that you can get through without finding some way to give people a story they can tell themselves. How are they going to be part of this new society? And so this idea of anti-fascism is really crucial in creating this sort of mythos, this idea of sort of the Socialist Unity Party, this forced merger of the Communists and the Social Democrats. We represent the victory over fascism. We represent the resistance. And if you join up, you get to be part of that. And you've got people who are ex-Nazis on the lower level. You've got people who are collaborators. You've got people who were happy to go on with Nazism. For a number of them, this gives them a way out of being failures, out of the total destruction. I mean, physical, spiritual, the huge trauma of being on the losing end of World War II as someone who believed in Nazism. This gives them an out, in a sense. And in terms of denazification, you have a total clearing at the top levels of things. Like the aristocratic Junkers are taken out. You get the industrialists are gone. These really top party members. But at the lower levels, you really see this problem that it's difficult to create a post-war German state without a few Nazis. There's too many of them. There's too many things that need people who had joined the party as best case scenario as opportunists that you're going to need to have them run things. especially when people start deserting the GDR. And this pattern that leads up to the building of the Berlin Wall, people just start leaving. They don't want to live under the Soviet occupation. And more you see, on the one hand, denazification at the top levels, but at the bottom, people who are brought in through the back door, they're allowed to take part in the new system so long as basically their Nazi past is kept quiet. And they're kept in place politically by this constant threat that if they act out, if they disrupt the system, we can pull out your Nazi past and kick you out. But this idea of sort of the total cleansing of the Eastern Zone, you have people in the Central Committee in the late 1980s who are former Nazi members. You have ministers of state. It's true, things like the judiciary get cleaned out compared to the West, but this idea of sort of the clean East compared to the Nazi-ridden West is really part of a mythology.
As you said, they're trying to get the population to buy in to the concept that they're offering there. And so they've got this like web of state-led institutions which are designed to sort of integrate and entice the citizens towards compliance.
Yeah, the first chapter of the book's really looking at sort of high-end politics. How do you get from the end of the war to the creation of the country? And the whole second chapter is trying to get into this problem that no matter how sort of ethnically homogenous a country, there's still a lot of diversity in any society that you look at. You've got people with different economic backgrounds, different social interests, different professions. Some people have disabilities. You have all these different ways in which people are different, but the state is trying to integrate them together under this banner of sort of a communist society in which everyone is equal. And they sort of, officially it's the workers and peasant states, but you also have the intellectuals, you also have factory managers. What do you do with the fact that you have a workers and peasant state where about half the country is a manual labor, you've got about 20% in agriculture, but there's a lot of different kinds of people, and there's a lot of variation on how much they actually think state socialism is a good idea. So there's this huge collection of organizations. So if you want to be part of a profession, you have to join an organization. It'll let you in, it'll let you practice. If you're a writer, if you're a lawyer, if you're in metalworking trade, you have to join the Metalworkers Union, which is part of this bigger union. Obviously, these can't go on strike, but there's an effort to try and bring in the whole population through all these different groups, all these different organizations. And if you just get people signed up for enough memberships of different kinds of groups, if they care about international solidarity and they care about decolonization, but they're not so big on what's happening at home, get them involved in a solidarity committee. And that person can feel good about how they're helping decolonize Africa, even if they think what's happening at home isn't very democratic. On the other hand, you can also get young people involved through these youth groups that are really crucial as funneling people into society, sorting them into who's reliable and who's not. And you have things like this paramilitary, the Society for Sport and Technology, which I remember I was talking to someone online and they said, the whole pitch was basically come out, we fire guns, we play with radios, drive motorcycles, and you get to meet girls. And this was this sort of soft sell of, we don't necessarily need you all to be in the party. We don't trust you all to be in the party. In fact, we're going to create a couple of other parties you can be part of if you're not, maybe if you're a Christian and you're not fully socialist, but you want to be part of the team. We've got the Christian Democrats you can be part of, and they'll keep voting with the SED in Parliament in this nice facade of democracy that's maintained. But you keep everybody tied together. He said this sort of dense web of organizations, institutions. And again, you can't rely on the Stasi for everything. You can't just send in the troops with billy clubs to bash everyone's head in every time they have a complaint. And you get them in a group, you get them talking about things, and you sort of funnel everybody into being productive, cooperative citizens.
And one of the ways they're sort of doing this is they're making the workplace very central to people's lives. So, this is where you'd get social benefits, so healthcare, childcare, holidays.
Yeah, especially, as I said, sort of starting after World War II, even just where do you get food? That these workplaces become the vehicles for any kind of social welfare and even just basic necessities. And so the place you're working determines where you get to live, where you get to see a doctor, if your workplace has proper childcare or not. So for women who are entering the workforce, who are being told they had to enter the workforce early on, this became this fight of sort of, is my factory actually providing childcare? So someone's looking after my kids while I go do my shift at sort of the metal stamping press or sort of the clothing factory. And it really sort of, you have this big centralized political state, but all the services that are offered, whether or not you get a holiday dacha from the unions and things like this, everything really gets focused through where you work as the point of contact with the state. That's where, if you're going to engage with the party, these sort of things, it's not necessarily going to state offices. It's that the people appointed by the state at the place you work, it's your boss is also in charge of whether or not you get special access to, say, like culture, if you can get sort of tickets to the theater, these sort of things. And it's all distributed as a sort of carrots and sticks that are out there. On the one hand, they can offer you benefits if you cooperate, if you're a good worker, you don't rock the boat too much. If you're difficult, then the people at your job can start pulling things back. Maybe they report you to the police, but to keep everything on even keel, to keep all these workplaces operating, especially with so many people fleeing the country, it really becomes these sort of informal negotiations between the people running plants, running factories, and the people working in them they've got a bit of leverage, because, especially if they're skilled workers, that they know the system needs them, and they are regularly testing just how far they can go to see what they can get back.
The GDI is trying to portray itself as this nation based on equality, but there's equality and there's equality. So if you're a member of the SED, you've got significant better privileges than other people. And if you're a woman, whilst there's gender equality, the reality is somewhat different.
Yes, I mean, these top people, there's a lot of privileges, but there's a lot of expectations. I think one of the things that comes with being in the SED, or if you're one of the people who signs up to become an officer in the military, which is a mandatory 25-year service period, and you get a lot of benefits that come out of this, but there's constant scrutiny. This is where you have the people who are most under the eye of the Stasi are the people who are part of the party, to make sure that they're not stepping out of line, they're not acting inappropriately. And so even the people who are getting the most benefit are also there with the most burden in some way. And he said with women, this problem that equality is there formally, women are expected to be part of the workforce, but you really don't have much of a change in terms of how domestic lives are lived. So women become equal, men aren't expected to really change as a result of that. So people talk about sort of the triple burden of women under socialism, that equality means you have to work a full shift at the factory. You're also out trying to stand in various lines for goods that are under shortage, doing consuming to get enough goods for your family, taking care of children. And on the other hand, you have to be politically active. You're expected to show up at meetings for all these organizations. You're supposed to be a good socialist citizen who takes part in things. This is where things like childcare become so important. This question of, is the state willing to put the money in to create the possibility for women to achieve this level of active citizenry, to be producing children, to be producing economic goods, and also to be showing up to talk about what's happening with the struggle against apartheid at some solidarity committee that week.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was people making complaints about the situation in East Germany. And that was one of the sections I found particularly interesting, is there was actually a formal legal method to submit complaints or suggestions. And this was used to talk about economic shortages and political issues. And I think one of my favorite ones that you had in the book, I think, is a woman from a town where she wrote in and said, "I'm afraid in our town we don't have any short or square women to fit the sweaters that are in the local shop."
I think we take it so for granted in different Western societies just how much the free market does to convey information about what people want. Like, if people don't like food at a restaurant, it closes down. If they think certain products are terrible, they don't buy them. And if you're in a command economy where a group of bureaucrats are trying to come up with, here are all the pants you can make in society next year, how do they find out what people like in terms of pants? They have to do a bunch of guesswork. And the system, the Eingaben system, where people can send in a petition, they're sending it in as a very specific literary style of, here I am as a good, loyal citizen, bringing attention to a problem you may not be aware of. You get some people go more passive aggressive than others. There's a real art to sort of just how far you can twist the knife sometimes. Like I said, this woman sort of saying there's sadly not many square women. You get other people who are complaining about shortages.
I think my favourite complaint is one from the 1980s where he says the GDR always wants to change the world and make it a better place, but not even being able to buy condoms, that's a sign of impotence.
Yeah, there's a wonderful letter that ended up in a collection of someone who mailed a desiccated tangerine they got at the supermarket to Eric Honecker personally, and telling him that we haven't had any good tangerines or oranges this year, and you are in charge of a one-party state socialist dictatorship, and people are sending you bad fruit because they want you to deal with this. There's a level of absurdity on one hand, but it's sort of like the petitions to the czar, going to talk to the king, that this older system integrated into the new, where people are just constantly writing in complaints about sort of what's happening in their workplace. Maybe they have a bad manager. And the key is always that you're doing it to make socialism work better. I was describing this while teaching a class, and one of my students very proudly explained that his grandmother had gotten the head of their collective farm fired because she wrote a personal letter to Brezhnev when they lived in the Soviet Union. And so these things also existed in other parts of the communist world, but they did really have effect sometime. And one of the things you can see when the GDR starts breaking down is that a lot of bureaucrats just stop answering their mail, that they might not accept the request, they might not do anything about it. But once they just start hiding from the mail, once they just start filling up boxes with letters and hoping people don't write back, there even this system of response to popular unhappiness, once that starts to grind down, that's when the wheels really come off.
Yeah, which we'll come on to when we reach the 1980s. I found it interesting that, you described the SED using these letters almost like market research to see perhaps what direction the next 5-year plan should be going in and that sort of thing.
When you think about what you'd have to do, just imagining every product a modern society could want, sitting down in an office somewhere in East Berlin and thinking, this is how many shoes they're going to want in Leipzig, and this is what style, this is what shape, this is how many children are we going to have. We're going to have to talk to the health department to figure out birth rates, to plan out how many children's shoes at what size you're going to need. It's a hugely daunting task. And this is sort of one way to try and figure out what you're going to need. But it's when you think through the mechanisms you need to run a command economy, it's a massive challenge.
Yeah, that's never going to go wrong, is it? We were talking about the formation of the GDR, and there's a lot of repression going on during that period, particularly in the period of the Uprising in 1953. But as you said, you can't just rule a country by repression, and that sort of mass terror holding the population together moves away towards this more social control. And okay, there's surveillance, but they're using sort of psychological methods to control people rather than torture or interrogation.
Yeah, 1953 is a really interesting case study here, because the lead up to 53, you've got the decision that we're getting rid of all this playing nice with the idea that we're a nice democratic state. We're going to work with these anti-fascist bourgeois parties. We're going to have a nice gradual historical transition. In 1952, we're hitting the gas, we're transitioning to socialism, nationalize industry, collectivize the farms, and we're going to go all out. And this is a huge austerity program. Basically, they're getting people to work twice as hard for half as much. And this is where, from the state side, they really try to test how much can we squeeze out of people with the promise that eventually it might get better. And this is right when Stalin dies in March 53. You've got the sense of political unsettlement. And even the Soviets start writing saying, we think you're going too quickly. You're asking too much of the people. You're not giving them enough back. And the SED tries to sort of roll things back. And you have an explosion of dissent, which goes from people upset about working conditions into, what if we get rid of the SED? And in order to put down this uprising, you have to deploy Soviet tanks. People are killed. And you have sort of ringleaders or people anyone suspected of this are being rounded up. But this is really what scares the SED, that things are really on a knife edge, that if we can't be guaranteed the population is going to stay still for this. And on the Soviet side, telling them, you need to keep people happy. You need to give some concessions. And this is what you said. This is when you get into more social control. You get the expansion of the Stasi as an organization that exists hovering above society. Sort of, it's ever present that they could be there, but you don't need a man on the front porch with a bayonet threatening you. It's the idea that if you don't take part in the youth group, you won't get into university. If you don't show up to work on time, then we might move you to a much worse apartment. I mean, this is also post-war period. There's a lot of rubble. A lot of people don't have shelter. This isn't sort of whether or not you get a nice vacation this year. This is, do you have an apartment that has running water? Do you have an apartment that is sort of secured from the fact that sort of the wind is blowing into a lot of these buildings for several years afterwards? Or are you a person who's going to get one of these shiny new pleasant concrete prefab buildings that actually have some modern furnishing in them?
Indeed, indeed. Now, the chapter you put together about the GDR's international connections, and particularly its relationship with West Germany, the Eastern Bloc, and the Global South, I found particularly interesting, because you often you sort of imagine, or you can see the GDR and West Germany as almost being like fire and water. They're completely separate, but there's a deeply entangled relationship, I think you describe it, that becomes even more entangled as the years go on.
Yeah, it's interesting because you really have the border shutting down for migration is the obvious place where you get a disconnect. In 1952, you start having the clearance of the German border. You have people who are sort of forcibly deported from their homes if they're too close to the border. You have the death strips that are created. You have the Berlin Wall going up in 1961. And for East Germans, you cannot cross the border until the 1970s, really, in some cases, except if you're a pensioner. West Germans can't come to East Germany until the 1970s, really. And this is obviously a thing to focus on because it's so dramatic and public, but there's so many interconnections in terms of trade. You've got the problem that West Berlin is right there in the center of East Germany. This is something you have to figure out how to deal with after the blockade the Soviets put up in 1949. And one of the problems for East Germany that West Germany is just always there as this better other. It's always there as the country we have to exceed. No one's really impressed when they have a better standard of living than Romania or Poland or, say, the People's Republic of China. Being the richest communist country doesn't cut it. It's we're up against one of the richest Western countries where they speak our language and almost all of us can see their television. And television's obviously the idealized version of most of what is going on. But sort of the culture is getting beamed in. So while you're trying to create a completely separate socialist Germany, it's always there in the background. What are the West Germans doing? How do we go up against it? Sometimes it's about blocking it, trying to prevent it from coming in, which doesn't work very well because radio signals and people can watch TV. But a lot of times it's things like trying to come up with an alternative to rock and roll that people can enjoy. And when that doesn't work, then you come up with your own version of rock and roll. So you have to have socialist bands that produce approved socialist rock and roll because the West is there. And you have to figure out some way to sort of take these things in and remake them, because otherwise then people will get alienated and just start listening to the Beatles secretly.
And also in that early history of the GDR, they're diplomatically isolated as well. Yeah. It was the Hallstein Doctrine with Konrad Adenauer, who's the first chancellor of West Germany. It's basically trying to make the GDR not look like a legitimate state.
From the beginning, both countries claim that they want reunification, and it becomes awkward over time when both of them have to come up with an explanation for why they're both separate. And for the West Germans, it's that the East isn't a real country. It's just a separate thing created by the Soviets. They said the Hallstein Doctrine, this is the diplomatic maneuver by the West saying, anyone who recognizes the East, we're going to cut off all diplomatic ties. We're going to cut off all trade. We won't give you foreign aid. And this is right when you have decolonization. And you've got dozens of new countries are being created. They all need their own diplomatic recognition. They're all looking for legitimacy. They're all looking for trade with a powerful Western country. And foreign aid is becoming this new tool of international affairs. So the West Germans really try to create this blanket that sort of comes down on all these countries as soon as they're formed of which side you're going to choose. And they're remarkably successful that they can offer more money. They can offer more legitimacy. And the GDR from the get-go it's recognized by the rest of the Eastern Bloc and China, and that's about it. And this is where you have the GDR gets shoved into global affairs much more so than it otherwise would. It's constantly going around trying to find newly formed countries that are in the middle of a political transition, and trying their best to sort of compete with West Germany in their own little version of the Cold War over who gets to be the real Germany. And it's like when you look at the United Nations, that the United Nations doesn't want to recognize the split of any of these countries. They say only one can get in. This is what comes up with China later, this sort of dispute over which is the real China. And there's a problem for Germany of eventually one has to be the real Germany and the other one not. And sort of this zero-sum game, which for the first 2 decades, the GDR is really languishing in isolation, trying to chip away at the edges, getting a bit of attention from Zanzibar right before it stops being a country and gets absorbed by Tanganyika to become Tanzania. And you get sort of the GDR ends up in all of these different parts of the world trying to work some magic and get someone to say they're a real country. And at first, it's not terribly successful.
Until West German Chancellor Willy Brandt arrives in the late 1960s, and he's pursuing a sort of form of détente Ostpolitik, which results in the Basic Treaty of 1972, where both German states are in the UN, and that fundamentally changes the international status of the GDR.
Yeah, so this dam breaks initially in 1969 with Cambodia and Iraq. So the West Germans had found a way to alienate Cambodia. The Iraqis, this is all sort of tied up in the Arab-Israeli conflict as well. And the West Germans under Brandt said, they changed tactics, seeing that this constant global fight to make sure no one ever recognizes the GDR is eventually going to break. There's only so much money they can throw at the problem. And too many countries start figuring out that they have leverage, that they can start throwing out there that they want a little bit extra. They'd like better trade terms, more foreign aid, similar to what you see with Egypt at this time when they're sort of playing the US and the Soviets off of each other, just on a slightly smaller scale. And so this combination of the West Germans start to fumble the Holstein Doctrine a bit, the East Germans start to get a few openings, and this mutual recognition between East and West Germany. They get into the UN, and then you have the Helsinki Accords that come up, and this rapid shift only in a couple of years where the GDR goes from this sort of global pariah state to being recognized by everyone.
I always find it interesting with the Helsinki Accords because that really opens East Germany to even more international criticism, and it gives sort of leverage for Western intervention and essentially becomes like a big liability for them as they get into the 1980s.
Yeah, the Helsinki Accords are interesting because on the one hand, it helps open things up. There's this agreement between East and West, this sort of final peace treaty of World War II, really. It means there's a lot more travel, there's a lot more tourism, you have a lot more people going back and forth, exchange of information and culture. And this is really when you have a huge proliferation of the Stasi, that this sort of opening comes with this constant perception of a security threat. And the other side of things, there's certain human rights guarantees that are made as part of the treaty. And the US starts trying to really lean on this as a way to find sort of some international legal leverage as a way to put pressure on what's happening domestically. You see this in Poland with Solidarity in the 80s, and the Soviet Union with dissident movements, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. But at first, this is for the GDR, it's sort of seen as this is finally guaranteeing our borders. We're finally being recognized as a country. And this existential fear that we are not even treated as a real country, and at any moment we could get wiped off the map. May the Soviets will get tired of us, and they're just going to pull the plug on the whole thing. This is seen as such a constant sort of Damocles hanging over the country, that Helsinki is seen as this good deal. We're a real country. We have real borders. I mean, we remember, too, that the eastern border of the GDR in Poland, for the longest time, West Germany was advocating not only getting back East Germany, but also the territory that had been annexed by Poland. So people talked about East Germany as Middle Germany, and Eastern Germany was actually what's still today Western Poland, and what's also Russian territory of Kaliningrad. So the idea that the Helsinki Accords are really crucial in just saying all of these borders that have basically been in place since 45, everyone's going to finally accept them, and we don't have to reopen the books on that. Honecker in particular, he sees this as the final triumph of East Germany getting recognition. And also, I think this is the transition from Walter Ulbricht, who'd been in charge in the earlier decades. Erich Honecker takes over in 71. Erich Honecker's really in charge for this period when they really start getting a lot more recognition. He's the architect of this. And regardless of the other politics, on a personal level, he saw this as a triumph, that he got to be accepted. He is a leader on par with the West Germans. He represents a real country. And I think this is something you see getting into the 80s, where it's really important for Honecker he goes on this world tour, going to visit other countries as a head of state who is recognized by other countries. I always found it interesting. He starts off with Japan and Austria, and these are slowly working his way back. And the final crowning achievement of this is that he gets to go to West Germany in 88 to go meet Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of West Germany. And the idea that as a communist leader of the GDR, that he has to be respected is incredibly important. There's all this economic side of things. There's this sort of geopolitical. But on some level, that for him as the head of the SED, this is the crowning achievement of German communism.
That footage of him in West Germany, I find is fascinating. You know, seeing the Bundeswehr playing the East German anthem and Honecker standing next to Kohl, and Kohl looks like a giant, and Honecker's this tiny. Well, he just appears really tiny.
It's just kind of symbolism for a book cover.
Yeah. And Honecker's originally from the Saarland, so he actually goes and visits his hometown and where he was born and meets his sister. You can see him sort of like brimming with, look, we are a proper country now. You know, you can't, push us around. But he's becoming more and more dependent on West Germany as well, even before then, for loans, because he's pursuing this policy of, is it unity of economic and social policy, which is really sort of offering a better level of consumerism to the population to try and match what's on offer in West Germany. But that is unsustainable in the longer term.
Yeah, I think this is, again, sort of the Ulbricht years, this is the Honecker years, that Ulbricht, especially the early years, sort of post-war period, that Germany is in really rough shape. There's very little in terms of consumer goods. You have rationing of basic goods into the late 50s. And this is a period of very austere socialism. This is people being told to go out heroically overperform their task to rebuild, to industrialize, to create a new country that will eventually pay off with the socialist utopia. And after a while, you need at least a bit of the utopia to show up. You can't just keep sort of hitting the snooze button on the payout. And for Honecker, that you already get this with Ulbricht, that initially the idea that the command economy is scientific. We've learned from the Soviets. They made Sputnik. We are superior to the crisis-ridden capitalist system, and we're going to overtake them. And then they keep on having crises. They can't produce enough food because farm collectivization doesn't work very well. Centralizing the economy creates all these bottlenecks, so people aren't getting enough products to produce into other products at different points of the supply line. And there's this real crisis that we need to produce enough televisions. We need to start producing enough clothing. And so under Ulbricht already, this idea that we don't need to get better than the West at everything. We need to get better at them at a few things. So we're just going to take out a whack of cash as a loan, put it into some key technical areas. And when we make a quantum leap forward, we're going to leverage that to pull everything else along. And this doesn't really work very well. A lot of the money gets sunk into things. They sometimes work, they sometimes don't. But this sort of miracle, one fun trick to solve your economic problems by just getting a lot of loans from the West and investing doesn't pay off in the way they're hoping. And as I said, Honecker has this idea, this sort of unity of economics and social policy, and they have this idea that essentially we're going to try to level out the benefits people are getting with the work they're expected to do. So we're trying to increase productivity, and that will come with benefits that you'll see one-to-one. Really try to incentivize people so that they feel like if I put in a few extra shifts, eventually I can get my own Trabant. I'll get a new prefab suburban apartment with some nice new furnishings. I won't be in some sort of pre-war wreck that's held together with duct tape and hope, with sort of no hot running water and things like this. So it's really this problem in the 70s. It sort of becomes this vicious cycle of taking out more money, investing in things, and the economy never takes off enough to really start paying back the Western money and stuff that they can export enough. And they really have this captive market in the Eastern Bloc, other socialist countries. They can sell the goods there, but they can't compete internationally. So when they go into, there's a big program to create an East German microchip, and they make a pretty good microchip. It's just too expensive to sell to anyone. It's not that they can't technically create these things. They can't create them at a price that's going to be able to compete with Siemens, Toshiba. They're the big German, American, Japanese giants. And so it's really not a question of competence, but can they create something that's efficient enough to be a real profit center to sort of haul the whole economy across the finish line? And eventually this just keeps spiraling and spiraling, where they're increasingly faced with this problem that if we want to scale back our debt, we're going to have to massively cut consumer benefits. But Honecker's whole plan for socialism was to constantly provide a better life through consumer socialism, which shows the system works. So he sees this sort of precarious thing he's created. If we start scaling back on the money for consumer goods, we politically undermine the system. But if we need the money, we need to start getting more and more in hock to the West Germans, and then we're in debt to our capitalist rivals. So he's sort of being pulled in both directions. Either we go back to austerity and we have uprisings, or we start putting the West Germans in the driver's seat about our fiscal policy.
He's sort of like kicking the can down the road, isn't he? And, I mean, how is he selling this contradiction to the East German population that he's taking out loans with West Germany? Because it must be reported on West German TV and the population are receiving that.
I think the main argument was that this is a period of peaceful coexistence. We can find ways to work across the border for peace. And this is really the catchword that keeps coming up. You've got the threat of nuclear war, and people in Germany are acutely aware of if things kick off, they're going to be the ones who are under a bunch of mushroom clouds immediately. And so a lot of these initiatives can really be sold as peaceful engagement for greater economic payoff for both sides. And you no longer have the sense that sort of the West is this terrifying foreign enemy, that with so much tourism engagement, people are watching television. The West is the enemy, but at a way that's the emotional heat on this has really dropped compared to, say, the 50s and 60s. Younger generations are used to the split of the countries. And you have fewer people where they're not seeing this through the lens of the West are still the Nazis who were the Nazis in the 40s. They're just the successor state who happens to be a capitalist, imperialist country. But we also still watch their television. We buy their products. And for a lot of people, increasingly also that we're selling them products.
So with all of this debt, I mean, it peaks at around 40 billion Deutschmarks, but it's still not doing the trick. And this is where there starts to be a rise or a rumble of dissent, because the SED are refusing to implement reforms, and you're starting to see these dissident groups appear.
Yeah, I think you get a lot of things coming together at once in the 80s, where this general sense of dissatisfaction that with all the money they're spending, the economy still can't keep up. People don't feel like they're getting enough. This increasing sense that the system's becoming more and more sort of ossified. You've got the same old people in control who've been there forever. Younger generations don't have social mobility like they used to. And you've got these dissident groups coming up who really come out of a lot of people from different backgrounds. Some of them are concerned about this unrestricted mass industrial pollution, that not just sort of things like the ozone layer, acid rain, but you've got communities where they've got the most polluted air and water in all of Europe. Places like Bitterfeld, industrial sites is dumping like pure poison into the local water. And if people try to complain about it, they get sort of threatened with being imprisoned for undermining the economy. And this issue that you've got a lot of people who are worried about things like mandatory military training for young people, the possibility of international, sort of the Cold War going hot, who are interested in peace activism, but on slightly different terms of the state. And they start to really coalesce together under the banner of human rights by the mid-'80s. You get people who sort of started off being apolitical campaigners for moral issues, local problems, and they all start really coming together with the idea that what we need are domestic political reforms where we get to have more of a voice. At the same time, from the SED, they really do not accept this as an argument and see anyone trying to challenge things from below outside of the proper channels as a threat. And this comes up when you have Gorbachev in the Soviet Union implementing reforms like Glasnost and Perestroika, this twin effort at sort of mobilizing people politically, shaking up the economy. And for the East Germans, this is all just heresy. They think the Soviets have lost the plot. They're going off track. And the key is we don't change anything. We hold the line against our own people, against our Soviet allies. And you start having things like the censorship of Soviet publications. You start having a lot of people who are looking around trying to figure out what even is the party line I'm supporting. That I've been a good, loyal sort of servant of the GDR, and now things are clearly starting to fall apart. Nothing's working. We're not supposed to actually engage politically and talk about how to fix it. And all of a sudden, the Soviets are the enemies. And the sense of people really feel unmoored, even the ones who are trying to be good, loyal citizens, because they don't know how to do that anymore. That everything feels like it's breaking. No one wants to fix it, and we can't talk about it.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the East German minister who says it, but there's some classic phrase like, if your neighbour changes their wallpaper, there's no need for you to change yours, or something like that.
Yeah, it's Kurt Hager, the chief ideology minister, that sort of comparing this to this group. We don't need to make these cosmetic changes like the Soviets and being completely dismissive. Whereas in previous generations, this line of to learn from the Soviets is to learn how to win. The Soviets are the wise elder brother ushering us into the glories of socialism. And now sort of we're on our own. Poland's in the middle of this sort of martial law crackdown. The Soviets have gone mad. And we're sort of going to have to stick it out here.
Yeah. We get to 1989, and one of the turning points is the realization amongst the population is the May 1989 municipal elections have definitely been falsified, because a lot of these, it's called dissident groups, have been monitoring these elections, and they can see that, you know, they knew it in their heads, but they've actually got the hard evidence then.
Yeah, the elections are interesting because is again one of those places where the previous systems of social control really start to backfire. That you had elections where you had to go and just, there's a list of the people you will be voting for. You go to the urn that says yes, you pop it in there, and you had the option of going off to the other urn to say no, where everyone can see you're voting no. So your neighbors see this, your boss sees this, the local Stasi agent sees this. If you feel like making yourself a social outcast, you can go do so, but it doesn't make a difference anyway, so why bother? So it's usually a pretty good enforcement mechanism of getting people to go and have to vote in favor in these elections. It's a nice little sort of ritual of loyalty. Once you get to 89, suddenly everyone can see how many people are voting no. And then the results get announced, and it's up. I think they decide to give a little sop to the opposition by saying it's just below 99%, instead of being 99.9% like it normally is. And it's so obviously fraudulent that the state tried to create a system of surveillance to prevent people from voting no. And that system of surveillance is telling everyone the SED's lying. They can't even accept a symbolic gesture in local elections of us saying we're kind of pissed off. And that really turns a lot of people that they can't even let us pretend to be annoyed at what's happening now. We all have to go along with this. And it's sort of a level of disrespect that's being shown that people really take offense at.
And events outside of East Germany are starting to affect the country itself, because the border between Hungary and Austria is opened. And so there is a way out of East Germany without climbing over a wall or without applying to emigrate. And things are starting to get into a spiral then. Certain members of the Politburo approach Gorbachev and say, look, would you be okay if we replace Honecker? And Egon Krenz comes in.
Yeah, things start to really get away with them with the migration crisis. All these people, suddenly a whole lot of the country wants to go camping in Hungary and not come back. And I think this, as mentioned, this problem, you have these mass demonstrations that the state blinks. And this had already been happening in the spring. You have elections and semi-free elections in Poland, but the crackdown in Tiananmen Square in China really creates this counterexample that people get a bit nervous. But by the fall, you have this cycle of people making demonstrations, people trying to leave the country. Then you start having expulsions of certain activists, which sets off more demonstrations. And eventually these Monday demonstrations that happen in Leipzig that just everyone knows to turn up. You don't need a leader. You don't need somebody to make any kind of organization. It just by word of mouth just starts building. And the state really, the SED, its whole security apparatus really blinks in Leipzig on October 7th when you get this massive demonstration. They bring in Krenz to try and fix things. And he's completely hapless, that he thinks he gets to be a GDR Gorbachev. He's going to be this great reformer. And similar to the post-war period, that he's massively overestimates what kind of popularity, what kind of legitimacy they've got in society. And he thinks he can make a nice slow rollout of a handful of tweaks, make it a bit easier to go on holiday to the West, and events just completely overtake him as these demonstrations continue. Everyone keeps on trying to emigrate. And the shaky economy, once you start losing that many professionals, doctors are trying to get out of the country, all these key people, it's like a Jenga tower as people are pulling out all these key blocks. And enough people who are running the system look around and think, this whole thing's just over.
I guess is it a close run thing as to whether the troops are used to try and put down these demonstrations?
The troops are certainly deployed. One of the big problems that comes up is this general sort of collapse of morale in the security services. You've got these militia groups that were formed after the 53 uprising. You've got the military, you've got the Stasi, you've got all these different branches, but the Stasi is really designed to tamp down on dissent in these tiny little dissent groups, to keep monitoring people, go after intellectuals who start speaking out of turn to Western media. They're not designed to clamp down on 80,000 people in the streets. The militia groups have the problem that everyone's related to people who are also out demonstrating. So suddenly people aren't turning up to work. Everyone suddenly has the flu. And the military is being called in, and the military has been training to fight the capitalist imperialist invasion. The military hasn't been trained up to be the domestic security force to clamp down in the same way. And nobody wants to be the one to kick off a massacre. There's nobody in the SEDs willing to give the order explicitly. I think on the one hand, you've had someone, Egon Krenz, this great reformer, had come out he had praised Tiananmen Square and praised the Chinese leadership, but he still doesn't have the sort of the guts to do it himself, in part because no one's really sure if anyone's going to listen to the orders. And so this problem at first, Honecker isn't willing to give the order. The military isn't willing to do so on their own and take the heat for it. And this is where this problem that the state as an entity no longer is willing to defend its own authority. No one's willing to put their lives on the line in the same way. No one's willing to kill for it. And once enough people push back on this, it's sort of like a door giving way. And this comes up with the opening of the Berlin Wall. You just have enough people show up at a border checkpoint one night thinking that they're going to be allowed to pass because someone in the SED gives a confusing press conference when he's a little too sleepy one time. And enough people show up and the border guards aren't willing to open fire, and they manage to push their way through.
An incredible evening that on TV, unbelievable times. And so there's an attempt by some of these dissident groups to sort of create a new sort of democratic socialist GDR, and the SEDs become the Party for Democratic Socialism, but really they're just overwhelmed by the money and power of the political parties of the West. And obviously the SPD existed in the West, so they're coming in to finance their party in the East as well. And, you know, there is reunification of Germany. But I think one of the chapters I found really interesting is the aftermath of the the GDR, because that's often the history often ends with reunification.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that whole dislocation, that societal dislocation, is a really untold story. It must have been like your whole world had, well, if you remember the SED, your whole world had disappeared. But just the degree of uncertainty. I mean, what were the challenges that GDR citizens were facing with reunification?
I think the thing that we talked about earlier, that you have people whose whole lives have been organized around specific workplaces. That if you grew up on a collective farm, that regulated where you lived, where you went to school. If you worked in a certain factory, that handled your childcare, it handled your social life. And one of the things that's really difficult in East Germany is that they get hit with all the same deindustrialization that the West had been hit with from the 70s onward. And they get hit all at once. It's like a ton of bricks. So the factory closures, the mine closures, in most Western countries, this has been something that's been a crisis since the 60s. A lot of communities, and it's been going at a much slower rate. And compared to, say, what happened with coal mining in Britain, that's a multi-decade process that's really traumatic for society. This happens in about 18 months in some cases. And the problem there, too, same as it had been before, just because you're part of West Germany doesn't mean these factories can compete on the international market. That you don't have Poland and Romania as these places you can just sell all your products to anymore. The GDR is suddenly competing on this, and they have good workers, they've got smart people, they've got, the products aren't all completely terrible. It's just they can't compete in the same way in most cases. And then you have a process of economically winding up the economy, which instead of examples like Czechoslovakia or Poland, where they decide to create these vouchers, try to sort of make mass ownership, there's this real hope of shock therapy. We're going to bring in Western companies. They're going to buy things up. We're going to make it as efficient as possible. And in a lot of cases, you have companies that come in who really don't have any interest in trying to maintain employment rates. They're just looking to see what they can make in terms of a quick buck. And they get there and find there's nothing to do with some of these factories. Like the Trabant factory it's using production technology from the 1950s still. You didn't have the investment needed to keep up in the same way. So even when Western companies come in as saviors, maybe you're going to lose 80% of the workforce, the steel plants, all these other things. So it's just massively socially dislocating, where people lose their social identity as part of these different groups. They lose their economic identity. And if they identified with East Germany as a country politically, it doesn't exist anymore. So in this way, that a lot of people come out doing well, in the sense that you do have a lot of people who made money off this. A lot of money sort of rushes in. And some people who'd gone from sort of regular working class people suddenly are the sort of nouveau riche that comes out of it. Other people who've been socially well-to-do, the respected intellectuals of the GDR, there's a rapid social decline. And then for people who are part of the Stasi or the SED, in some cases, they're facing prosecution for shootings at the wall. They're getting kicked out of their jobs, and they're basically unemployable at that point, and sort of put at the same level as sort of war criminals.
And you've also got West German citizens coming over and reclaiming property as well. So you've been perhaps living in a property for 20 years, renting it, and you're just kicked out, are you? What happens to those people?
There's a system for compensation, but there's this idea of essentially sort of returning things instead of having to compensate people. But you had things like, you have so many layers of political repression in German history that it becomes this problem that you have, say, someone who was a Jewish victim of the Nazis, that they had property that was seized from them, picked up by the Nazi state, taken over by the SED, handed out to somebody who then sold it to someone else at some point. You have this long chain, and that there's a process of restitution, but it's not frictionless. You get a lot of people who are suddenly displaced by this, or you said if they're renting. And this is part of a larger problem of property changing hands, privatization. West Germany is going through a phase in the 1990s when the state's privatizing as well. So public housing in general is being put onto the open market, right, as all this other housing is also getting shoved in there. And yet a lot of these neighborhoods are these waves of gentrification and people being pushed out as new people are showing up. But not that everyone is victimized by this, but even the people who did well financially went through a radical transition process.
This hits women more than men, because by effectively becoming part of West Germany, you're taking on West German laws. And there's some quite significant differences there, particularly around areas like abortion access.
Yeah. In East Germany, it had, initially after the war, abortion had been banned because they were worried about population demographics. This gets liberalized in the 1970s. And West Germany had also had a push to liberalize abortion law, which had been rolled back by the courts. And even till today, abortion at any time is technically illegal, even if you can access it under 12 weeks for specific conditions. And in the East, becomes this huge conflict that for a lot of women, they're losing their job, which means losing access to childcare. They're no longer as economically independent. And this idea that we have political self-determination and democracy, but we've lost control over our own bodies. The good liberal democratic state now has more of a say over what I can do with my own body than it was under communism. And this is a real sticking point for a lot of people, this sense of gaining political rights while at the same time a sense of being disenfranchised in other ways, particularly in this gendered way for women, that also leads to the fact that you have a lot of women who emigrate to the West looking for new economic opportunities, that if things aren't going to be happening in the East, that they're going to go looking elsewhere.
When we look back at East Germany now, if you've lived in that country, you look at it differently to perhaps somebody from West Germany. So there's various challenges around how it's remembered historically. Obviously, there are tourist attractions and museums, but some statues are removed, some remain. How does the new Germany deal with those challenges of remembering that nation?
I think you do have this process of cleaning up the memory landscape. So you have the giant Lenin statue in East Berlin gets disappeared. The huge bust to Ernst Thälmann, the interwar communist leader who was killed at Buchenwald, it's still up. It's actually near to my apartment, so it's very strange going out with my kid as she's learning how to ride a bicycle, going around a giant communist bust monument and seeing there's someone put up an exhibition seeing sort of a visit of solidarity from the leader of the Derg regime in Ethiopia opened the local park where my kid plays. It's very strange periodically to sort of connect those two together. In terms of memory, you've got a lot of commemoration of things like the wall, of victims, but this question of sort of everyday life and things like that is really touchy because you've got people who may have been very disgruntled in the era of the GDR who found that after the collapse of the wall and reunification that they've come out feeling on the worst end of things or feeling like things have gone wrong, that they don't feel part of the same narrative of the sort of the wonderful uplift of the two countries coming together. On the other hand, you've got a lot of people who also feel like the kitschification of the GDR is sort of, you can go out and get the little egg cups, the Ampelmann, all these other things, that this is this slap in the face to people who are victims of the system, people who've been suppressed by the Stasi, who've been imprisoned, other people victimized by everyday authoritarianism. And there's this real tension between the fact that people had different experiences in the GDR and their families themselves, they've had such different trajectories coming out of it, that you have this disconnect between the big master narrative of the wall came down, everyone was happy, unification was good, and people's individual lives that don't necessarily line up there. I think some people overcompensate into a level of nostalgia where it really erases a lot of the negative aspects of the GDR. On the other hand, you still have people who talk about things like it's the 1950s and everything is just this totalitarian Stalinist hellscape. No one could have had a happy life in any way. And if you mention a happy childhood memory, you're an apologist. So I think in this way, there's one of the things about the book, writing a book like this, that on the one hand, working as an academic, you're trying to sort of say, here's as dispassionately as possible, here's what happened, but also having to respect the fact that this is still a really meaningful history to a lot of people who lived through it, whose families lived through it. And even if you disagree with people's interpretations, you have to respect that there's these completely different subjective understandings of what happened that even if you don't agree with them, I think it's important we acknowledge they're there and acknowledge these conflicts and understand that you can't just wish them away because they're not scientifically accurate.
It's a fantastic book. I learnt so much from it. I think one of the most incredible facts for me was that East German pensions didn't match the amount that West German pensions were at until 2023.
Yeah. There's a lot of, sort of the country's still in a process of coming together. There's a lot of these different statistics where you sort of see these East-West divisions, and you always had split between North and South in the West, but these hangovers from that time that are really there. And I think that sort of going back to that question about history, you can see it in sort of television presentations about our history, that this sense that East Germany was actually part of German history is really missing sometimes. The sense that people had a history or had lives that are really part of sort of German history, that sometimes sort of, and then some new people arrived in the 1990s. And so this way that, again, this problem of the ongoing divisions in Germany, not that everything is still perfectly split East and West, but it's a sticking point that's more than just a subjective feeling or a sense of people being aggrieved about cultural portrayals. In some cases, it really comes down to money, is it property, the economic chances you have.
You have been listening to Ned Richardson Little, the author of The German Democratic Republic, The Rise and Fall of a Cold War State. There are links in the episode information where you can buy the book and help support the podcast. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.